Susan Jimison, I was going to just kind of go through her bio, and I can see Deed's publication is already raring to say some things too. But Susan has written a number of books. She and her husband Mike, where's Mike? Mike, stand up, another Vietnam vet. And I was going to start telling her story because it's really a great story. But I'm going to let her tell the story as well as about her new book. She's written a couple of books, and this lady is just a class act. They had if you remember a couple of years ago, they used to come over when we were over on the other side of Perimeter, and they had a bookstore. And I'm just sorry that the bookstore didn't stay open because it's just, they had some great stuff there. But Susan, why don't you just come on up? And again, you have just got such a story. You're a class act, a great lady, and besides that, Mike married way up, trust me. So, Susan, take it away.
My story is that, well, some of you know, my brother was killed in Vietnam in 1969. I was 14 years old. Is that working? And I didn't really know that much about what he was doing in Vietnam. And 27 years after he died, my father just didn't wake up one day, and I realized if I don't find out what my brother did in Vietnam, it's never going to happen. And so it took me, with the power of the internet, 2 weeks to find somebody that he was in flight school with, and that kind of snowballed. And I started going to the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Reunion, Helicopter Pilot Association reunion, and met most of the guys that he flew in Vietnam with and that he was at flight school with. And so in 2002, I won't tell you that whole story. Well, I'll go back. Anyway, I ended up marrying one of them, and so Mike flew with my brother in Vietnam for about a month before my brother was shot down. They were both pilots with the 361st. And so meeting, and you all have probably experienced this, but meeting people that knew my brother and knew what he was like as an adult, and not just the big brother that used to tell me that I made a better door than a window when I stood in front of the television. It was good to see, what he might have become. So anyway, I was in my grandmother's scrapbook in 2002, and my uncle and aunt were trying to give me letters that my dad had written to her during the war. He was stationed in the South Pacific, and we were kind of dismantling the whole scrapbook, and I came upon a letter. Wasn't from my dad, but I looked at it, and I read it, and it said, "Dear folks, you must not feel badly about my death. The small part that I have played in the war, though it has cost me my life, I am glad to give. That life has meant much to me, but not so much that I am too distressed at leaving, and neither must you be. I had only a few things planned for the future. One of the most important was a nice home. Mama will please me much if she will live in a more comfortable home with many flowers and trees. I am happy, and so must she be. Love to all, John Jr." Well, I couldn't imagine why that letter was in there, and so my uncle explained to me that his first cousin, also my dad's first cousin, went to China to help the Chinese people in 1941 with Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers. And then, of course, the only thing that I knew about the Flying Tigers was the John Wayne movie. And so that was 2002, and I started doing research and learning more and more about the Flying Tigers, and how there was only 100 men that were recruited away from their positions in the military to fly with the Flying Tigers. And so I started putting a book together. I didn't know what I was doing, because there was just so much interesting information that he had that I started writing a book. But then in 2011, I went to the Vietnam Veterans Day ceremony in Washington, D.C. with the History Channel, and it was the year that Vietnam HD came out. And so I went on the honor flight, and when I came back, my writing class was interested in what I was doing, and they said, well, why aren't you writing about your brother? And so I put all of the Flying Tiger stuff aside, and I ended up writing a book about finding my brother's unit. And I want to say it's a book about Vietnam, but it's not. It's more about what the families experienced, and a lot of it has to do with the music and the protests. And but in the end, I ended up marrying somebody that my brother knew, and so it's not all sad. But anyway, I have a slideshow, if technology works. Whoops. Technology works because there's a man in the back that's doing it like the Wizard of Oz. But anyway, John was a college educated, was stationed at Pensacola when he was recruited, and like I said, this is what I knew about the Flying Tigers. It was John Wayne. So I had a lot to learn, and I met John Donovan's brother, Jim, who was a lot like me because he had lost his brother in the war and really did not want his brother to be forgotten. And he truly loved his brother until the day he died. So this is one of the covers. Apparently there was more than one, but I did watch the movie again, and what an awful movie. I mean, the acting and it's just not, we have much better technology now. So, speaking of technology, hold that thought. If this works. But no sound.
History in World War II. They have accounted for considerably more than 400 enemy planes since Christmas. Brigadier General Claire Chennault, commanding the AVG, knows Japanese tactics. His theories of aerial combat have proved sound in practice, and his squadron's victories have made the Flying Tigers the terror of the eastern skies. When they aren't shooting down Japs, the Tigers keep in trim with popular American sports. They have become familiar sights in nearby Kunming. Each man gets a bonus of $500 per Jap plane destroyed, so they're good spenders. American aid to China, although slight in most respects, has shown what it may be when more U.S. pilots like these fly a pattern of victory over the Far Eastern Front.
So when I met his brother, he told me, and this is along the same lines as the Atlanta History Center, his brother had donated all his photographs, all his scrapbooks, and the letters that he had written home to the Pensacola Naval Air Station Museum. And if he had not done that, I would not have had access to all these letters. And to put together his story, over 70 years later, I thought was, pretty amazing that I could still get my hands on his original letters. When he was on the Bosch Fontaine, and he was on the third ship to Burma, they split up the group in three different boats, but he was on the last one. So when John got to Burma, all the planes were pretty much spoken for, so he never had his name on the side of the plane with his kills on the side. And so anyway, see if I can work this thing. There's Pappy Boyington sitting there, the bad boy who never finished with the Flying Tigers. I think he had trouble with authority, but anyway, He was there for a little while, and he flew with the 2nd Squadron, which was the Panda Bears. So I don't know how many of you are Navy, and if you cross the equator, and if you're familiar with the shenanigans that go on. But he writes about this in one of his letters, how they got smeared up with fish guts, and they sat in the chair, and then they were dumped into the pool on the ship. And he had a lot of pictures. He was fascinated with how hard the Chinese people worked. And when I started reading through his letters, I realized he must want more than just his mom or his family to see what he was seeing. And that's why I wanted the title of my book to be Through the Eyes of the Tiger, because he wrote it with such detail and enthusiasm, and he was very outspoken. And when the bombing of Pearl Harbor happened, I mean, you can tell his anger in his letter. So his caption on the back of this picture was a human steamroller. You can see in the back the things they were pulling there. When I look at this picture and look at the shoes and hardworking people. So this is an interesting picture because this plane has no shark's teeth on it. And I should say that there was 100 pilots recruited, and there were 100 airplanes, P-40s, that were sent to China. And one of the crates fell in the water when they were unloading it, so they only had 99. But they only had 99 pilots too, because one of them, he did something wrong and his passport was denied, and so. But there was never enough airplanes, and John writes about that a lot in his that there just wasn't enough. So this is where the shark's teeth came from. The Illustrated Weekly of India was laying on a table in one of the pilots' rooms, and he asked Claire Chennault if he could have his plane painted like that. And Chennault said, no, you can't have your plane painted like that. They all have to be. And so at that point, they started painting all 99 planes. So John Donovan was with the 3rd Squadron. He's down here. This is the pilots. And then this was in his scrapbook, and I put the date on it because it was on the back. All the pilots are standing, and all the crew and armorers are on the bottom. And in most pictures, there's usually a little dog mascot. I can't see it in that one, but that one you can. There was a lot of little dogs over there. So this was the 3 squadrons, the Adam and Eves, the Panda Bears, and the Hells Angels. And the Adam and Eve started off being red until Chennault saw it on the side of an airplane and realized it looked too much like that big red Japanese circle. So he said it had to be a Granny Smith apple instead. So that's why it's green. And John was fascinated. I have all my notes here, but I'm just not using them. John was fascinated with this gold leaf rooftop pagoda. And then, he spoke about that in one of his letters, but also how he had to take his shoes off. And that boy from Alabama just was not used to doing that to go into any kind of a building. And the caption on this one, he said it was Snake Charmer. And this one too. Yeah, that's what I said, good grief. So like it says, the training accidents were common, but his caption was, and expensive. They didn't have a lot of parts for the P-40s, and so when they did have an accident, they had to really just take it all apart and keep using the parts on it. This was another one. So you probably all know Claire Chenault. John's caption on this one was just the Colonel. And John's caption on this picture was, and sometimes it was. So like in that little clip when it talked about they were getting their exercise, he had a couple of photos of playing softball, and it was really Chenault that insisted that they get out and get some exercise. So all the planes, because they were Chinese planes, had the 12-pointed star on the underside of the wing. He took a lot of pictures. So it took a long time to get letters home. I don't know how long it took you guys to get a letter from Vietnam to your parents or your wife, but these had to be opened by censors, and that just delayed the whole process of the mail. This is one of his letters home right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This isn't the first letter he wrote after Pearl Harbor, but you can see they cut out where it was, the date it was, and whatever he wrote down there at the bottom. And he talks a lot about the Japanese. And then this one, he was talking about their boots that they were having made there to their specification, but it was where they were being made that they cut out. So of course these are all John. But in the first photo, he's wearing a Chinese hat. The second photo, he had a caption that they were waiting for the Generalissimo and Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And the third one, which makes me sad, because he said, this picture I will keep a long, long time. And of course, he, well, you don't know this. Well, he died in May of 1942. This photo, his caption is, it was kamikaze. And he never wrote about these young girls. I had to do a little research to find out what this was all about, and there may have been a letter at some point, but I couldn't find one, about these gold rings that they put around their necks when they started this off at 5 years old, and it was all for beauty. This tribe in Burma believed that a longer neck was more attractive. Well, these two pictures I put up here because John said the Navy would never have let us fly these planes that look like this. And they were pretty rough. This is actually a gift from another flying tiger. So 70 years after John was gone, this was sent to me. He found it in his dad's photographs after his dad died. His father was R.T. Smith. Some of you probably been to Wright-Patterson, the museum in Dayton. Well, this was originally John's jacket, and when they died, they auctioned off things like this, and the money was sent home. But it was originally John's, and then Tex Hill wore it, and then George Bailey wore it, and then I don't know if George Bailey donated it or his family. But this is all along the lines of the Atlanta History Center. So, and then you can go online and you can Google it, and then it comes up. So long after you guys are gone, you donate stuff to the museum, it'll be there forever. This is the Alabama Veterans Memorial right outside of Birmingham, right off of I think it's 495. And that letter that I read is what's in that pillar there. And there's a lot of different things. I think some of them have Purple Hearts and the citation. So it's a really well done memorial in Birmingham if you haven't been there. So that's the letter that I found in my grandmother's scrapbook. And the way that the letter, it doesn't read smoothly. I don't believe that John wrote it himself. I believe he dictated it to the chaplain on his way out on his last mission, which was, and I should say this, John was actually killed in Hanoi. It was French Indochina then, and he was strafing Japanese planes that were at the Jialam airfield, and he wasn't alone, but he was the only one that was shot down and killed there. I have received his file from Fort Knox, and it was not easy to get. But as a civilian, when he was shot down, he was buried in Hanoi. And then that was 42 and 46, they dug him up, they moved him to Shanghai, and they buried him there. And then my aunt kept on them until he was brought home in 1949, and he's buried in Montgomery, Alabama. So I always like to tell about this young lady that I met at the Smithsonian. She asked me to take her picture. And of course I did. And I asked her, why do you want to be taken with this? This was back in the early days when I didn't know much about the Flying Tigers. And she was very, very sincere, and she put her hand on her heart, and she said, because they were our heroes. And since then, I have found out that there are 4 museums in China honoring the memory of the Flying Tigers. So anyway, that is my book, both published by Bob Babcock. Dear Mark, I don't want to say it's about Vietnam, it's just about what it was like, and then my journey to find my brother's unit. And so I always want to tell people it's not all sad. But I like to close always with 5 little known facts about the Flying Tigers, but you guys are all pretty well read on military history, so I might be preaching to the choir. But Chuck Older, who was with the 3rd Squadron, and he also was the 3rd highest scoring ace, credited with shooting down 15 Japanese planes, was the judge for Charles Manson. So that's a huge change from his military career. I should add here that John only shot down 4, so he was not an ace. And there was a second volunteer group. So John went over with the first volunteer group. And there was a second, and they were on their way. They were on 2 different Dutch ships, and Pearl Harbor happened. And they were totally rerouted. They were stopped in Australia and turned around and had to come back to fight for the United States. So yeah, I already told you about Albert Baumler, who had a colorful past, and he got in trouble. So his passport was denied. And Claire Chenault, the AVG commander, he had chronic bronchitis that affected him the whole entire time he was in China. And he went over there in like 38 and didn't come home until after the war. A lot of times he was laid up in sick bay. And he was a smoker. But ultimately, he died in 1958 of lung cancer. And then the other thing that I find interesting, because the Flying Tigers went over under contract with a private person, not with the government. And so in 1996, after a couple of years of scrutinizing their records, the United States agreed that they were under military they were under military command. And so the pilots in 1996, and as you can well imagine, most of them were gone, but the families, like John's family, received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his time in China. And all the grounds crew were awarded the Bronze Star. So it took a long time, but they finally admitted that President Roosevelt knew more than he was saying about the Flying Tigers going to China. So anyway, if there's any questions, see if I have answers. You guys probably know a lot about the Flying Tigers, because I know that, you know, once you start going on military history, it just kind of all goes back. And I think that there was a couple of units in Vietnam that ended up painting their helicopters to look like that.
Susan, when the war broke out against Japan, and we declared war, were the Flying Tigers then aggregated into U.S. forces, or did they remain Flying Tigers under contract in China?
They were under contract with China until July 4th, 1945. So I've run into a lot of people over the years that say, well, my dad was a Flying Tiger, and then he'd show you a picture and he's wearing a uniform, and you know right then it was not, because they just wore whatever, as you could well see. So, any other questions? Yes?
Did you say all the planes were Chinese manufactured?
The planes were Curtiss Wrights. They were supposed to be going to the British, and the British said those were becoming obsolete. They wanted better airplanes. And so with this whole Roosevelt secret transaction with the Chinese, he managed to get in the middle of it and get the planes that were going to the British to go to the Chinese.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Stay up here with me. Thank you so much. We learned so much from history, and we think we know it until you have somebody who obviously knows a lot more than we do. Susan, if you would come back and join me, though, we have a gift for you. We appreciate so much you coming, and just as a small token of our appreciation, this is something we give to all of our speakers. This is the Vietnam Service ribbon, and some people use it as a paperweight. Other people have other uses for it. But anyway, we thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Susan.